I turned 85 last winter. The cake was small, store-bought, and the candles were those trick ones that keep relighting after you blow them out. I laughed when I saw them, even though there was no one else in the room. My children used to argue over who would light the candles. That morning the house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock in the hallway. I didn't expect a party. At my age, expectations shrink. But I did expect a phone call. It never came. My kids didn't stop loving me overnight. That would have been easier to understand. It happened slowly, like paint fading under the sun. First, visits became shorter. Then they became next week. Then soon. Eventually, they became silence. They all have busy lives, careers, grandchildren, responsibilities. I told myself that over and over. I defended them when friends at church asked why I always came alone. They're just busy, I'd say. I became very good at saying that. The house used to feel full. Christmas mornings were chaos, wrapping paper everywhere, laughter bouncing off the walls. Now the living room felt like a museum of old memories. Family photos lined the mantel, frozen smiles from decades ago. I'd sit in my recliner and stare at those pictures longer than I should. I wasn't angry, not at first. I was confused. How do you go from being someone's whole world to being an occasional obligation? I tried calling more often. Sometimes they answered. Sometimes it went to voicemail. When they did pick up, the conversations were rushed. "Dad, I'm heading into a meeting. Mom, I'll call you back." That call back rarely came. I started rehearsing what I wanted to say before dialing, afraid I'd waste their time. Imagine that, afraid of wasting time at 85. One afternoon, I fell in the kitchen. Nothing dramatic. I tripped over the rug and landed harder than I expected. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling. The thought that scared me wasn't the pain. It was the realization that no one would know if I didn't get up. I managed to pull myself to the counter and stand, but something inside me shifted that day. That evening, I sat at the dining table and made a decision. I could spend whatever time I had left waiting for my children to remember me, or I could start remembering myself. It sounds dramatic, but when you reach a certain age, clarity arrives without ceremony. I wasn't done living just because they were done visiting. The next morning, I cleared out the garage. It took hours. I found old fishing rods, rusted tools, boxes labeled in my late wife's handwriting. Instead of crying, I organized. I donated what I didn't need. I kept what mattered. It felt like I was reclaiming space, not just physically, but emotionally. I joined the senior center down the street. For years, I'd driven past it without a second thought. Walking in that first day felt like the first day of school. I half expected someone to tell me I didn't belong. Instead, a woman named Margaret waved me over to a card table and said, "We've been needing a fourth." Margaret was 82 and sharper than most lawyers I've known. There was also Frank, a retired mechanic with stories louder than his laugh, and Lillian, who brought homemade cookies every Thursday. They didn't know me as Dad or Grandpa. They just knew me as Harold. I hadn't heard my own name spoken that warmly in a long time. I started going 3 times a week, then 5. I signed up for a watercolor class, even though I hadn't painted since high school. My first painting was terrible. The sky looked like spilled soup. But when the instructor pinned it to the board with the others, I felt oddly proud. I also learned how to use video calls properly, not just to wait for my children to answer, but to reach out to old friends I'd lost touch with. I found my army buddy's daughter online. She helped us reconnect. Seeing his face on the screen after 40 years felt like stepping back into youth. I began walking every morning, slowly, carefully, but consistently. I passed the same houses, the same trees, the same barking dog at the corner. Eventually, neighbors started waving. One young mother introduced herself and asked if I could keep an eye on her porch deliveries while she worked late. I told her I'd be honored. Being needed again changed something in me. It wasn't a grand purpose. It was small, but small purposes add up. I realized I had been waiting for my children to give me a role in their busy lives, instead of creating a role in the life still in front of me. Months passed. My phone still didn't ring often, but I stopped staring at it. I filled my days intentionally. I read books I'd postponed. I cooked real meals instead of heating frozen dinners. I even hosted a Sunday potluck for a few friends from the center. The house began to feel alive again, not because my children returned, but because I did. Laughter echoed in the kitchen once more. Different voices, different stories, but the same warmth. Then something unexpected happened. My daughter called one evening. She sounded hesitant. "Dad, we've been meaning to visit." I almost said, "You've been meaning to for years," but I didn't. Instead, I said, "That would be nice." They came the following Sunday, all of them. The grandkids looked taller. My son had more gray in his beard.
They seemed surprised to see fresh flowers on the table and paintings on the walls. "Dad, you've been busy," my daughter said, looking around. There was something in her voice. Relief, maybe, or guilt. I didn't press it. I simply told them about Margaret and Frank in the watercolor class. At one point, my grandson asked if I could teach him how to fish. I hadn't been in years. The rods in the garage suddenly had purpose again. I realized then that my children hadn't stopped loving me. They had simply assumed I was waiting for them, waiting for time to pass, waiting for the end. But when they saw I was living, truly living, it changed how they saw me. I wasn't fragile glass on a shelf. I was still their father, still capable, still growing. They began visiting more regularly after that. Not every week, not perfectly, but intentionally. The difference was subtle, yet real. I stopped measuring love by frequency. I measured it by presence, when it happened. I let go of quiet resentments I hadn't admitted even to myself. Aging teaches you many things. One of them is this: loneliness grows in empty schedules. Purpose grows in action. I don't know how many birthdays I have left. None of us do. But I no longer sit by the phone counting the hours. If my children call, I answer with warmth. If they don't, I still have a full day ahead of me. The senior center recently asked me to help organize a veteran storytelling night. I said yes before they finished asking. Sometimes the life you're waiting for is the one you have to build yourself, even at 85. My children didn't stop visiting because I was unlovable. They stopped because life pulled them forward. I chose not to let it leave me behind. So here's what I did when my kids stopped visiting. I started living again. And strangely enough, when I stopped waiting to be remembered, I became someone worth visiting.